This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Up dog.
All right, this is how this is gonna go.
One of those days, man.
Yeah.
Up dog, or did the S get cut out? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I said up dog, and you were supposed to say, "What's up, dog?" And I was to be like, "Not much, you." It's this sweet joke from The Office. Damn it, Andrew.
Dude, I've seen The Office so many times. I'm sorry.
That makes it worse.
But it's to a point now where I'm sick of it. It's been too much. I've seen it a lot. I dated a girl who watched it a lot.
And that's our episode today.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Chris Oliver watches Andrew and Jason banter podcast.
Let's skip this banter.
I can just narrate.
Before we go and do the thing, I finally shipped my stupid website. I did it. It's been 2 years. I don't care. I've been talking about this podcast for a long time. It's done. It's not done yet. It's not even close to done, but it's done. There you go. That's my accomplishment.
It's
all right.
Close to done, but it's done. I like it.
It's published, right? So at the end of the day, it's done.
Where is it?
andrewm.codes. And the best part is I'm finally publishing stuff again that I've had saved for all this time. But anyway, we've got a great guest on today, and I'm excited to get into this because I was at RubyConf with Jason, and Jason and I were hanging out. Apparently, Jason thinks I'm funny. I've been told that. My heart swelled with pride and love and feelings in that moment. But we were hanging out and we got to talking to Benjamin Wood, who I had never met before, but obviously knew of. And he started showing me some stuff on his computer at the table. And I was like, dude, you have to come on our podcast. So we're going to get into it. But Ben, thanks for coming on the show. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. It's good to be here today. I had a great time at RubyConf. Looking forward to seeing you all at RailsConf and all of our other Ruby friends back there as well. So my name's Ben, software developer. I own a software consulting company. I've got a business partner as well. His name's Nate Vick. Our company is called Hint. The web address is hint.io. We do all sorts of work, but primarily Ruby-centric and Rails-centric. So yeah, I'm sure we'll maybe talk about that some more later, but that's kind of the context. And I've been doing things with Docker for a number of years. I ran a Mac when I got into code and started using Docker, and eventually went all in on Linux just because of how much Docker I was using. And now things are kind of getting back to the point that's hey, I could probably use a Mac again. I'm really excited about it. And partially because of the things that I think I was showing you and we were talking about. And that actually was on a Linux laptop, I think, that I was showing you. But I've got a MacBook Air sitting over here that I've been using recently, and it works just as well under this scenario. So yeah, running Docker, connecting to your containers remotely. And then one layer of abstraction above all that is Codespaces, GitHub Codespaces, which is essentially doing that as a hosted service for you. So I've kind of come up with some configuration that allows me to do both. And I've been pretty successful with it. And I was excited to share with people at RailsConf. Not that I'm the only person that's doing this. I'm sure there's others, but it feels fresh. It's somewhat new.
When GitHub Actions and GitHub Codespaces, like the remote containers and stuff, were all rolling out. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of wondering if you were in the same position, because at that moment, when that was all happening, I was at the peak of my knowledge of Docker because I have been working on it constantly. And so all this stuff with GitHub Actions started rolling out, and I was like, oh, I know how to do this stuff. These are just Docker containers, right? And then the Codespaces, and I was like, oh, these are just So I'm wondering if that's what really allowed you to propel into this, just having that little bit of knowledge there, and then GitHub kind of blowing open the possibilities for it.
I think it was. I think most people's entry into Docker usually is around production, which is really where unless you just absolutely hate Docker for reasons unknown, everybody agrees Docker is good for production or generally containerizing things. Where people tend to differ is whether or not Docker is good for development environments. I actually started with development environments because at Hint, we work with a lot of different clients. I'm constantly jumping between projects. And for years, it was just a nightmare of trying to maintain one environment that runs all of these different applications, not just different applications in the same organization, but different applications across many organizations that have very different requirements. And so that just became a pain to the point that I was like, okay, I got to figure this Docker thing out. And so I started using Docker for development specifically. And then from there went out to, oh, hey, it's just like you were describing, and you're like, oh, I know Docker now. I can use it in production. And then, it was pretty natural using it in CI as that started happening. We used to use Circle CI back in the day, and they did this thing where they went Docker. It was like Circle CI 2.0, I think, right? I don't know if it was Docker before that, but it was reinvented. And now, GitHub Actions is great on Docker. Yeah. So it's kind of a natural progression, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it was exciting. The whole development though thing. So here's what happened to me today. Today, I sent a text message to a friend of mine that I work with. And I was like, it only took me 45 minutes to get this application from not on my machine to running fully. And this is an old application because I spent like 15 minutes at least trying to install Sherlock Holmes or whatever in ICU4C errors. Then I went to image magic errors. So conversely, by the time my Docker images all download and then everything sets up in the containers and then they all boot up, it takes a long time too. So you said you're kind of waiting on the development thing because I'm kind of waiting on the development thing. I used to be hardcore Docker and kind of backing down.
Yeah. I would say I'm not personally waiting on the Docker for development thing. There's some reasons. One of them is that I don't run Docker on a Mac still to this day. And when I was saying that this kind of enables running Docker in Linux and using a Mac, I mean like remotely connecting from the Mac to a Linux environment. And things are faster, certainly. And also it depends on your internet connection speed, stuff like that, right? Like I got like a 1.2 gig connection here at my house, which is awesome. And which just like as a really quick sidetrack, I got really excited because I got a 1.2 gig, it's cable connection. And I bought a new cable modem that supposedly supports like theoretically up to speeds of like 4 or 5 gigs or something like that. Well, it's got a gigabit LAN port on the back of it. How are you supposed to get like beyond a gigabit when it's got a gigabit LAN port? So I had to go like buy another modem and then I had to upgrade my entire network just so I could even get that just a little bit beyond a gig here in my desktop. But anyways, that aside.
They'll do anything to say like that thing is putting out a gig, right? Oh, it's your cable. Why don't you upgrade to Cat 9?
Yeah,
like,
right.
What?
Yeah, yes.
Hold on.
Yes, exactly.
Hold on. Since we've taken this.
Okay. Here we go.
Andrew, you say that, but when I moved in this house, similar problem. I have Comcast or Xfinity. I get a gig down and I was getting like 300 and I was like, come on.
Yeah, what the heck? Yep.
Yeah, so I called Comcast.
Not okay.
They're like, have you tried using a better Ethernet cable? And in my head, I was offended.
But it worked.
It worked. That story was real, Jason. That's why I said it. That story, they told us to get better Ethernet cable, and that definitely helped a lot.
It helped so much. I've never been so embarrassed in my life. Obviously, I didn't say that to them, but
right,
the shame is
You're
real.
using like the Amazon basic like Ethernet cable and wondering why your thing's not putting out a gig.
Yeah. What's funny is the reason that I think it's confusing is that you can use any old Ethernet cable with any old network device, right? Because backwards compatibility is so good. It's like, oh, what kind of cable are we using? Okay, use old school. But yeah, like the newer cables just have more wires. But if I understand that correctly, like the newer cables have more wires. And so obviously they're capable of transferring more data. So it's not like terribly intuitive to think that like, oh, I get a different cable and it's going to be better. Anyways, so back to the Docker thing. Yeah, Docker on Linux, I think that's important. Even in an M1 world where you're running natively, like without Rosetta stuff going, like Docker on Mac is still not as fast as native, just running something outside of Docker. So I will digress on that. But, Codespaces is running in a Linux environment. So things are snappy there. And like I said, internet connection speed is important. Codespaces obviously is going to be really fast in terms of pulling images and whatnot. If you're connecting remotely up, there's not a whole lot of downloading that's really happening to your own system. That is all happening out in a remote environment where your application is running. So that doesn't solve all the problems. Certainly, like having Docker in the mix for development definitely adds a layer of complexity that I think once you put in the time to really know the ins and outs of Docker well, it doesn't really get in your way. That's my experience, but it takes a while to get there. Like, I mean, maybe more than a few months. You might be working with it for a year or two before you're really just like, this is so natural to me that I don't want to think about it anymore. And maybe really what it is, just you get to the point where you forget what it was like before and it actually is more complicated. I don't know. I don't have the perspective anymore,
Yeah, I did that. It's true. But let's take a tiny step back here. So we're sitting in this conference table and I'm obsessed with automation. Mm-hmm. I'm obsessed with my iDevices and doing things with them that is like should not be done and all this sort of stuff. And we're sitting there and you're like, yeah, I can run my apps on my iPad. So let's talk about what Codespaces is, just in case someone out there doesn't know.
So GitHub Codespaces is a relatively new service that GitHub created. I think it's actually still in beta. If it's not in beta, it just very recently came out of beta. I
think it is.
Okay. It actually originated as a Microsoft project. It was called Visual Studio Online, I think. And it basically was Codespaces. And I used it back in those days before Codespaces existed. And I loved it. and then kind of morphed into Codespaces. There was this weird period of time where they both existed, and it's like, wait, which one should I be using? Should I be using Codespaces or this other like Microsoft thing? And then the Microsoft thing got shut down and morphed into Codespaces permanently. So yeah, what Codespaces is, it's just a remote development environment, essentially. It's heavily Docker based. So the idea would be that you have a development Docker configuration for your project or your code or gem. It doesn't have to be an application. It could be just some library that you're doing development on. You want to be able to actually run your tests, though. It's not just to edit code, right? Because you can edit code. Here's a tip. This might be worth the price of admission. If for those that don't know, I'm sure you guys probably already know this, but like, did you know that when you're GitHub, you can press period, the period key, and it gives you like a VS Code in your browser to edit stuff in that repository. And it's like aware if you're like in a pull request. Am I remembering this right? Like you're in a pull request yet?
Yeah.
It like opens up the pull request in VS Code in your browser. It's amazing. So that's cool, but that doesn't actually allow you to execute code. It's fully running in your browser, which is just nuts, but you can't run your tests and stuff like that.
Certain node extensions, because it can't use all of the extensions in the extension library because it's running in the browser.
Because it's running in your browser,
right.
Yeah.
So there are some node-based extensions that they have ported over availability for, which are cool. But yes.
And they're expanding that every day. I keep seeing that they're adding new extensions that can run in the browser, which is very cool. But yeah, when it comes to actually running your code, not talking extensions, I think that gets a problem. Maybe you can run some JavaScript. Seems like it probably could. I haven't tried. I've only edited in that context, but that's where Codespaces comes into play. And you can have a full environment just like you would on your development machine where you can run tests and I don't know, anything that you would want to do. So what's great about Codespaces is there's a lot of things that are great about it, but I think the main like defenses for it is it like makes it really easy to start developing on a project, whether that be an internal project such as GitHub itself. A couple of months ago, GitHub announced that they moved to using Codespaces for the development of GitHub primarily. And there are, I'm sure, some folks that aren't using it still, but like that's their default, like, oh, you're getting set up as a developer at GitHub, use Codespaces. And so they went from like taking a week to set up a GitHub development environment. I might be overstating that, but like a long period of time to literally a minute or two. I think they might have even gotten down to less than a minute by like doing some Codespaces ready caching stuff. I don't know if caching is the right term, but basically like there's a hot code space waiting for you when you're like, I want a code space. So it doesn't have to spin one up and set it up and install, packages. It's just like, it's there almost instantly. So that's cool. I was listening to a podcast, I think, where somebody from GitHub maybe it was GitHub Universe or something, was talking about the benefits of this. They said that it hasn't only been helpful to their developers, but also they've noticed that they started getting contributors from people that wouldn't normally contribute code. Other people in the organization that have access and privilege and everything to do that, but would normally be like, I can't do that. Like I need a development environment. That's going to take forever. And also I don't really know what I'm doing maybe, right? Like they're not totally competent to do it. But with Codespaces, you click a button and then you're editing things. So project managers can make text changes and things that they wouldn't otherwise do. They'd be like opening a ticket. So it's like just really helps to flow a lot. And then open source, that's a huge one. If you want somebody to contribute to your project and the first thing they have to do is spend a whole bunch of time figuring out how to run an environment that can run the tests and all that kind of stuff versus click a button in the GitHub interface. By the way, GitHub Codespaces, I didn't mention this yet, but like you don't need to use VS Code outside of the browser to actually run. Like you can run VS Code in your browser connected to this remote environment. So you're running code in your browser, full on developing, making a pull request, the whole flow without ever doing anything on your own system. So that takes some upfront work from somebody that's maintaining the project to actually build the configuration for that. But it's not rocket science. But if you've got Docker basics, it's fairly straightforward.
Yeah. So Bridgetown has a dev container JSON configuration file in the root. And you're right about the open source thing, especially since the period thing came in. I was in the Codespaces beta and I was like, this is cool, but like there's still like this amount of time between I'm here and like I see something and I'm a very excited person. So I'm excited to do something. And then there's that lag. And then my focus is like boing, 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 boing. Yep. So for the period, the VS Code just on the web,
yep.
I really like that because I've used that to edit a lot of docs recently.
Yeah.
And I also love if you're an open source maintainer, you can add these configuration files to your repo so that anyone coming along could just run it in the code space. And there's none of that frustrating time. And you talked about how you can do it. You can work on it in the browser, which I feel like most people are very aware of. What people I feel like are less aware of is that you can also connect to it from your local, which I think is like the best part because you don't have to clone it. I don't want to check how many just random repos are around on this machine, but it's a graveyard. So the fact that I could just quickly get into it, open a PR straight from like my VS Code on my computer without cloning it, I think it's amazing.
Yep, I agree. Just generally the idea, like you were talking about having repos around on your machine, the idea that you eventually get your development workflows to the point that like a development machine is really nothing special. You get a new Mac and you're like, well, I guess I need to go to the App Store and like install maybe Slack and like Spark and like some other productivity apps that I usually use. And then for development, what do I need to do? Like I need VS Code or Vim or whatever your flavor is, like that's capable of doing remote development. And then your machine is really nothing special. You don't have to maintain it. You don't have to worry about how long it takes you to set a new one up. You don't have to worry about, oh, am I persisting this configuration somewhere? I'm being anxious about losing it. That's a really nice like side benefit of doing your development in this remote fashion, is that all that configuration and complexity lies outside of your actual machine that you're interfacing with your editor on.
Right. So this doesn't work for the period, but if you have a .files repo in your GitHub account, and if you're syncing your VS Code settings through GitHub, then GitHub will automatically find that .files repo and apply them, and will automatically find your VS Code settings and apply them.
That's right.
So like when you log into your Codespace, all your plugins will be there. Everything's there right in the browser. It's cool.
That's really cool. I love that, because the whole idea of being able to code on your iPad or whatever requires basically this kind of setup where like, yeah, whatever device you're wanting to write code on just needs an internet connection and a keyboard and a screen.
Yep.
And that's pretty sweet. Are they also setting up because obviously it's GitHub, so like they can probably wire it up so that your GitHub account is, your Git config's already wired up for you, so you can make commits right there.
There's nothing else you have to do. Like once you get into a GitHub Codespace, you've got the repository there and you can push commits and such. You don't have to worry about putting your SSH keys in there or anything like that, which is usually a hassle. If you have the past of using Docker for development, like at some point you've been running it and I'm like, what's the right way to do this? Like, how do I get these credentials and end up part of my image or something like that?
Right. That's another point that I was going to make, because I know that a lot of people have tried to use Docker locally in development, but what they're doing is building the image locally and then running the tests through the Docker run thing. Whereas this is, you're shelled into your Docker image and you're just running everything inside of there. And you're not like interacting with Docker really. You're already inside of Docker, more or less.
Yeah. So basically what's happening is VS Code is actually running as a service inside of Docker. And then you also have VS Code running in your browser or on your machine if you're actually running the VS Code app. And it's just connecting to the container and communicating with the VS Code server. And so that architecture that VS Code has been working towards for a long time is really important to how Codespaces works. And Codespaces and the remote development containers extension that's in VS Code are very similar in a lot of ways. The underlying core technologies are shared between the two.
So when we were sitting at the table, you had a little starter repo.
Yeah. How about I describe what I did, if I can remember what the process was, so that everybody understands like what we're talking about. My goal was to demonstrate creating a new repository and firing it up in Codespaces and getting straight to editing things. And I think I did do this maybe all on the iPad, or maybe I started on my laptop and then anyways, you could do it all on iPad. There's no reason that you wouldn't be able to. I will put a disclaimer that editing in the browser on an iPad is not the dream that I want it to be yet. So if anybody's like, oh my gosh, like I'm going to just start using my iPad for development now and I don't even need a laptop. I want that future, but we're not there yet, at least in my experience. There's like just enough annoying things that make it productivity wise just impossible to use an iPad seriously. Definitely doable though. If you're like, I'm going to bring my iPad because just in case, that's totally possible. Because you can do stuff. You just want to spend 8 hours working in a code base. And there's reasons which I could get into if we want to talk about that more, but we'll skip it for now. But still, it was a cool demo, right? So let's talk about iPad for a moment. So yeah, the first thing that I have is I have a project template, and it's just my GitHub handle is Benjamin Wood. So it's Benjamin Wood /project-template. And I'll share these links so we can put them in show notes or something later. And this project template, I have actually marked in my GitHub as a project template so that when I create a new GitHub repo or project, I can start it from this project template. And all that this has in it is a .dev container JSON file. That's configuration for Codespaces and or the VS Code remote containers extension. It has a Docker Compose .codespaces YAML file, and it has a Docker Compose YAML file. So the Docker Compose YAML file has some configuration for just running Postgres. It's all that I have in there by default. I usually use Postgres on projects. I figure it's easy enough for me to remove, but it's nice it's there. And also just sort of provides as an example of like, hey, this is where you put your services, not application code running services, but your kind of like external like Redis, things like that. And then the Docker Compose .codespaces.yaml file is the configuration for actually running your VS Code server, I guess, right? Like that's where Codespaces is actually going to run, is inside of that container. Or if you're connecting to a container running on your own Linux host somewhere using the remote containers extension, that's where it's going to run Codespaces. So there's that. So basically, like I could create a new project. It would have these files in it by default. So then I could just go hit the launch Codespaces button, like from the browser on the iPad or from the desktop or whatever, and it would just fire up right away. Now, there's also the .files piece that Andrew was talking about earlier, and I have that set up. So I've got, you can look at my .files, again, Benjamin Wood //.files. And let's see. So there's my configuration here. There's also a Docker directory in here, Docker/Ruby, where I have pre-built a Docker image that has my .files already loaded into it. So basically, like it's a Ruby image that has all of my stuff in there already. And thus, when I hit launch Codespace, it's not building a Docker image from scratch. It's actually just pulling a Docker image that already exists, which, by the way, is hosted inside of GitHub because it's inside of the like image, the packages, I guess. It's an image repository, essentially. So Codespaces just pulls it like that. I mean, it's super fast. I go from like creating a project to clicking the launch Codespaces button to having a working development environment, running Postgres, and I'm ready to like, gem install Rails and Rails new something in like less than, I think I could do this whole demo in like 60 seconds. Don't test me on that right now, but I think I could.
If you're listening to this podcast, then who's making sure that your application is running correctly? Is the app up? Are bugs plaguing your users? Do your cron jobs execute correctly? I don't have to worry about this because I have a secret weapon, Honeybadger. Honeybadger works with my unique workflow, is easy to set up on all my projects, and gives me peace of mind throughout the day. The best part is that Honeybadger has all the tools I need in an easy-to-understand UI with excellent documentation. I want to build features, not waste time trying to configure my tools, and Honeybadger provides that for me out of the box. Sign up for Honeybadger today and let them know we sent you. Thanks to Honeybadger for their continued support of the show.
So yeah, that was the demo. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the idea is that you could do this with Codespaces, or I could create a new repository, SSH into some EC2 instance or some remote environment, or my Linux desktop that I have at home and in my home office here. Clone the repository that I just created, Docker Compose up, and then connect to that container from a remote environment like my laptop.
I'm going to ask you a really vague question. And if you have no idea, that's fine. But if you do know, then we'll have to talk later.
Okay.
I feel like you might know how to set up like a home network somehow. Yeah, I feel like you're the guy.
I probably do know how to set up a home network, and we could talk later. That actually brings something to mind that's a really useful piece of my own personal setup. I do run some things in Codespaces. I don't actually run a lot of my stuff in Codespaces because, like I said, I got a Linux desktop, super powerful. It's got like 12 processors, 12 cores, bunch of RAM. Like, it's great. I use something called Zero Tier. You guys familiar with Zero Tier? It's like VPN software that doesn't really feel like VPN software. Basically, you create a network, which you can do like through the browser interface. You have two machines join this network, you authorize them, and then suddenly they both have their own like what appear to be local IPs, like 192.168 addresses. And you can communicate between those machines anywhere. And it just works flawlessly. It's not like, okay, like I got to connect to the VPN, like open up the VPN software and like, it kind of feels like it cuts all that out. It's just like these two machines or multiple machines if you got other things joining, including iPads, by the way, and iPhones, because I've got software for that. And yeah, you can communicate like you're on a local network. And I just don't have to think about it. So I've done that between all of my environments. And I just don't think about whether I'm on my home network or I'm out. I'm not like, oh, now I'm at Starbucks, I need to change configuration. I just don't do that because I communicate through these local IP addresses, even when I'm on my home network. And I think, I'm actually not 100% sure, but I think that when you're local, your devices are still communicating locally on your network. And if they're not, I don't know how it's so fast because it does seem like it's a lot faster at home. Not that speed's a problem when I'm out and about. Like it's plenty fast enough. So yeah.
That is awesome. I think I used some software like that a long time ago because my friends and I would try and play Counter-Strike or something together.
Yeah.
But we were using LAN mode and then had some, I forget the name of the software, but it was something very similar that was doing that. And it makes me wonder, like, is that sort of doing, you remember Dyn DNS where you could have it update a DNS record from your home IP that would change all the time? Yeah, I wonder if they're doing something like that where it's locally, they could just have it hit your regular IP.
Yeah, I think it is. And another way in which it's not like your typical VPN software is there is no, to my knowledge, again, I'm not like uber zero tier expert, but to my knowledge, there's no like central VPN software running somewhere that everybody's connected to. It is peer to peer, which would make sense why it's fast, like on the local network. And also cool because it's pretty lightweight for them. So it's like in terms of operating costs. So it's free for the use that I use it for. Like I'm sure they've got paying customers that use their pro features. I just haven't needed them yet. So, that may change. It probably will. I'm often very surprised at how solid it is and what kind of value they're adding and the fact that I'm still using it for free. So maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot here if anybody from zero tier is listening to this, but I would pay for it. That's what I'm saying.
There's several things like that I have that I'm like, I am really killing it on this free plan.
Right.
And some of them I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to pay for it because I don't even need it. I just want to support them.
Yeah. Is everybody using VS Code day to day? Is that what you guys are using? Yeah.
Not that Chris guy. He's got to be special.
I'm
special.
I'm still using Vim, but like at this point, there's so much stuff happening in VS Code that is so handy that at some point it's like, well, might as well. I do notice it is significantly slower jumping between windows or something, but like, it's whatever. At some point, there's so many cool features and the deep integration with GitHub and stuff is just phenomenal.
I'm excited to see that other companies are trying to recreate the kind of things that Microsoft has done with VS Code. Because I love VS Code. And also I don't want to be like a VS Code fanboy that's like only cares about VS Code. Because the truth is like people use all sorts of different things and for good reason. And also it's better for us as developers to have multiple options out there competing with each other and keeping up with each other. So like we really don't want VS Code to just take over. There's RubyMine and that whole group of IDEs. They like just, I think fairly recently released a private beta or something.
I was trying to remember the name of it. It's some new JetBrains product that's supposed to be a very lightweight version of their IDEs. Yeah. Which would have been great to have in college when you open up that freaking Java IDE and you're like, oh my God, what happened here?
Totally. My understanding is that like a main key goal of this rewrite, if I understand correctly, it's like it's a total do-over, is to architect it in such a way that it can do the sorts of things that VS Code does with remote execution of code somewhere else and interface running in one place, which you can kind of do some of that stuff already with RubyMine. Like they have this projector, I think it's called, where you can like have RubyMine running remotely and then you're controlling it. It's not like BNC, but it kind of is the same idea because like the UI is actually being broadcast over the wire. And so you're interfacing with like that. It's not like you're actually running the software locally that's connecting and just like moving information back and forth. It's like the UI is actually going over the wire. So, but that's not the same. It's not as good.
Okay, so you're a good person to ask this to. How do you feel about the state of the VS Code Ruby extension?
Yeah, I don't think it's quite there yet. I think it needs some work. I use SolarGraph, which is better, I think. But if you were to ask me like, okay, what things of SolarGraph and what things of the Ruby extension are you using? I'd probably be like, I'd have to go look because there's overlap and I'm doing some things with the Ruby extension, some things with SolarGraph, and I don't even know what's doing what at this point. Like I've got it all working the way I want, but it's weird. Yeah.
I'm in the same place. I know a bit more about the divide just because out of anger, I have fallen closer to this VS Code extension development area, especially when I'm using an extension and it doesn't work the way I want it to because it's only looking for HTML ERB files. And I also want to look for ERB files. And it's insane to me that they didn't add in ERB with HTML, right? There's no wildcard. It's just HTML ERB. And I can go fix that. And I've built some extensions before, but the main developer is working for, or they were the last time I heard, they got hired by Microsoft because of like the work he had been doing with Ruby on VS Code. And then he just gone. So there's another guy that just kind of stepped up and I'm sponsoring him on GitHub now because for a while he's like, I don't have any time to do this. He was the only maintainer. and he was doing so much of the work. And so now he's accepting sponsors, but not a lot of work has really happened on there. But it's hard to like look at that extension and be like, what needs to get fixed even? It's hard to tell with a lot of things what's even happening. There's not a lot of insight. And there's also a lot of like, if you move machines or sometimes gems can play with each other, sometimes you're using bundler and sometimes like it can't find your bundler. I have intended to and have like started to taking like a step from that stuff and like uninstalling everything and figuring out what does what. And what I've mostly found is that all those Rails snippet extensions kind of suck. And I really hate that because they've forced me to start building my own.
Totally. I think the Ruby community needs like a Ruby VS Code extension that does all the things. And I don't know what it would take to get there because SolarGraph is kind of forked and done its own thing and offers a lot of value. It'd be cool to see those come back together. And as we know from RubyConf, a new focus of Ruby that Matt's mentioned is developer tooling and working on like IDE support and core language things to support the stuff that the IDE is doing, which makes sense, of course, with the optional typing and whatnot that's been works. So yeah, like I think that overall they're like VS Code included, but not exclusive. There's some work that needs to be done for the Ruby developer. And companies like JetBrains that have done RubyMine have solved a lot of those things and make things just work, which is great. But not everybody wants to use RubyMine, and there's reasons for that too.
But at the end of the day, the RubyMine debug functionality uses the same gems as VS Code.
That's true.
I think about that a lot. That means that I could make it work.
Yeah.
Please don't tell me that. I said right before we started this, I told you that I had gotten VS Code's new Ruby debugger working with the new debug gem. Sweet. And so what I also got working is RBS type checking in VS Code. So there are actually some members of the Ruby core team now releasing extensions.
Yeah.
None of that work is going to like the Ruby extension. And like, honestly, I feel like someone has to be paid to do that. And dude, I'll pay. If you're out there, hear my cry. There's a lot of us crying. I feel like that could get some like payment, but maybe they'll just yank it like Faker or whatever. Who knows? But yeah, so there is some like movement, but it's just the core kind of ecosystem is so muddy. And there's also so many extensions that don't really work. And some of them kind of like overlap each other. And it's so tempting not to want to come in with like a brand and just like take the best parts of all of them and just be like, okay, so all these snippet ones that are overlapping each other, just stop overlapping. And now we have a new package.
It's like that old joke with protocols. Basically, like we just need one more protocol that'll fix it.
Then
so I agree with you, and also it's like, dang it, that's probably how we got here.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. What I'm actually proposing is like a massive amount of work that will never probably get done, and I'll just think about it.
It could, but it takes us working together, right? Like it takes the Ruby community, it takes Ruby core, it takes Microsoft all like communicating and being like, hey, let's get all this stuff that are kind of disparate parts and bring them together as much as it makes sense, at least. And we're not saying it should just be one massive extension necessarily, but at least make it so that there's a clear path for a new Ruby developer. Because that's a huge problem. Like somebody that joins our team at Hint, they're like, hey, okay, so I haven't been using VS Code, but I want to start using this. Is like everybody's using VS Code at Hint, almost everybody. What extension should I install? Because I have no idea. Not just because they can't go find the extensions, but like when they go to look for extensions, they've got like 10 choices for everything. And options and choices are good, but it can also really muddy the water. As I think you said, it is kind of muddy right now. It's like, what is the right thing to install? What should I be using? And the trade-offs between like SolarGraph and the Ruby extension, for example, things are better in which.
Yeah, which the most annoying part about that is that SolarGraph and the Ruby plugin overlap some features. Mm-hmm. And because of that overlap, it can put you in these really weird situations where you don't understand what's happening. Because you don't have Rubocop running via the Ruby extension, but it's running via SolarGraph. Right. And so if you don't have like a SolarGraph config, then Rubocop is always going to try to run. Like if you're not specifying to use Bundler for your Rubocop, it's just going to use a global Rubocop. But like what if you don't have Bundler in that specific project, you want it to switch to the global one, right? So
totally.
What I really want to do, and I really hate that we've now done this, because now what I really want to do is I want to get like a meetup of people who all use VS Code and Ruby, because I know there's a lot of us out there.
Oh yeah.
Because I've gauged interest before. It's high. I just want to get the group together, and then we can finally like get some money behind actual time on this. Just looking at NFTs.
Yeah. Chris, have you tried the Vim extension in VS Code? Like, have you dabbled with that? And how'd you?
No, I haven't. I have a little bit. I think it was actually the most accurate one that I've run against, because using that in RubyMine or anything else, like there's some like core things that just don't match up. And it's so hard to unlearn those habits. So I think the VS Code stuff has been almost like, it's not really feeling like I'm outside of Vim for the most part, which is
That's
great.
cool. That's good to hear. Like, I've heard mixed reviews and I've dabbled with it a little bit myself. I've never used Vim like as my primary editor, but I know how to quit it. So I guess I know how to use Vim. And yeah, it seems pretty good to me. I think that there's even some, I don't know if it's if it's like the main Vim VS Code extension, but like I think that there was something added within the last few years that lets you execute commands in like NeoVim or something. Have you seen this? Like if you're a Vim power user and you actually want to be able to run commands, not just like have your keyboard shortcuts mapped, there's a way to do that, which is really cool. I haven't tried it, but I can imagine I imagine that would be really useful.
I don't know. I feel like I've learned enough Vim to be efficient at what I do, but I know 1% of what I could do with Vim.
Right.
And so I'm probably not in a bad place to switch over, because ironically, like when I switched to Vim, I used Sublime before that. And my transition was made easier by using Janus, which was like, let's go map as many shortcuts in Vim in Sublime. And so it was like, it made the transition a lot easier there. And I think probably going back to VS Code or something wouldn't be that hard. It'll be like your guys are talking about, like all your plugins, getting those correct and whatever, and just having all your equivalents and whatnot for that stuff is another thing to go through and learn and figure out when you've got 12 options, which one or 2 or 3 do I need?
I own the domain like VS Code on Rails or something like that. And I've started to work on a course for that before I got bored. But I just started learning Vim and VS Code. I bought a course online and I just learned, what did I learn today? I learned YY4P.
Okay.
That's what I learned today.
I can't tell you what that does, but maybe Chris?
It yanks 4 lines and then pastes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's what YY4P. Yeah. It duplicates the 4 lines. Yeah. Yeah. See, I'm learning.
I do this cool thing. I hold down Shift. I just down 4 times and Command right.
It's like the ability to like select in the tags like that I want, and like the navigation by words like that.
Yeah, that's super handy. Or you can like D% and delete everything inside of this tag or whatever. And those are pretty convenient. That I think was one of the things where I was like, the reason I went to Vim in the first place was I noticed that some of my coworkers and friends that were using Sublime and stuff, they were like spending an awful lot of time. They type a little bit and then go to the mouse and then highlight some code or like click where they wanted to type next. And I mean, I was just watching that being like, holy crap, this is slow. And I can watch Ben Ornstein edit text lightning fast. And I was like, yeah, no mouse. How can I do that? You can just do that with VS Code or anything too, but learn your keyboard shortcuts and like how to interact with your editor, and you'll end up saving yourself a lot of time just
100%
doing basic things.
Yeah, totally. I had mentioned earlier that I went to Linux. I'm like, I am drawn back to Mac OS, but the keyboard is one of the things that has just made me go like, man, I don't know. Like at my desktop, if I want to give up my Linux desktop, like I've gotten there with workflow things that, not to say that you can't do them in Mac OS.
Oh,
There's some that would definitely be pretty difficult.
No, you can do all of them now. Now with Monterey, I guarantee you I can do it. I have the ultimate hacking keyboard, and with the shortcut Maestro
keyboard.
Oh, dude, it's a great keyboard.
Do you have the mouse module? And
I just got those. I just got that.
What mouse module did you choose?
The little red ball. Yeah,
the little red ball.
But it's got the buttons at the bottom.
Yeah, so like the ball, like the old school, like rolling ball thing. Yeah, that's the one I used to.
Yeah.
Ultimate hacking.
Sorry for everyone to do that. Yeah. No, it's awesome. But I've got this thing now where like between Better Touch Tool, Alfred, and the shortcuts on Mac OS now, I can do anything.
Cool. We'll have to check that out.
Well, is there anything else that we need to know about these remote kind of development environment that you've got running? What are the biggest cons?
Biggest cons?
Other than Cox going out.
Man, I'm the wrong person to ask because I just love this stuff so much. I know there's cons, and it definitely depends on who you are, but like I don't have cons off the top of my head. I love it. It's really great. I use it every day, and I don't do any development outside of Docker, and it would be a big pain if I tried. So there it is right there. It's learning curve. I think that's what it is. And then Linux, right? Like you can't run Docker locally on your machine. You shouldn't. I wouldn't. Don't do it. If that's your constraint, then just don't bother. I agree. Like I will agree with those folks that say don't do development in Docker because it's slow. Well, that's because you're not on Linux. And
to put a cap on the iPad conversation, because that's a conversation I hear coming up more and more. I don't think it'll ever be something that the majority of people will want to use until it's an app like Swift Playgrounds is now.
Yep, 100%.
And as long as it's on the web, it's never going to be a full replacement.
Yep.
For some people.
If Microsoft released a VS Code app,
yes,
it'd be awesome. And the reasons are like, it's not that VS Code in the browser is dramatically different than VS Code as an app. It's things like you switch away from your tab in Safari running VS Code, you come back to it and it's like put it to sleep because Apple does that kind of stuff. Oh, like the tab is using a lot of compute power because it's doing a ton of JavaScript stuff. Like I switched out of that context and it just goes to sleep. So I would find that like I'd be switching between the editor and like opening up the preview URL, which that's provided for you. So like if you're running a Rails server, you can just like view your Rails server and it's all tunneled and everything. And then switching back to the editor and it's like, oh, now I got to wait for like 10 seconds while it reconnects. So all that stuff, I think if it was an actual app, they could use the APIs to actually keep things alive and not have them shut off on you constantly. And that'd be great. And some of the keyboard shortcut things that you can't do in the browser, like or even on a desktop, there's some keyboard things that you still can't do in the browser, which are just annoying. And then this is a silly one, but this one was really annoying. So like I always position my terminal on the bottom of the screen. And I know like a solution to this, I could just change what I do and I put my terminal off to the side or something in the browser. Like I could do that. I don't want to because I shouldn't have to. All right. So my terminal's at the bottom, and in the latest release of iOS or iPad OS, they have this little like keyboard, like floating keyboard.
Oh, yeah.
It always ends up in the middle of the screen. Every time you focus an input, it like returns to its position. It's right on top of the line where you would be typing something.
And you can't hide
always swiping it out of the way, like every time swiping it out of the way. And I'm just like, I got to use something else. So there's little things like that need to be fixed.
I'm on the development builds of Apple stuff, and I've been so surprised that they haven't fixed that yet because that's so annoying.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a killer.
Well,
someday.
Ben, thank you so much for coming, talking to us about this. I had a lot of fun. I hope the listeners learned some stuff. Where can they follow up with your adventures and journeys and stuff?
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter just as Benjamin Wood. I think we've got some links going around from the stuff we were talking about earlier, which I presume will go in the show notes, maybe. The like project template .files. Yeah. I mean, feel free to like fork or borrow any of that you like. I don't hold any of it super dear. So reuse it, share it, ask me questions. I don't know if I have issues enabled on all these repositories, but feel free if issues are to ask questions there or just hit me up on Twitter. Happy to discuss.
My new life hack idea is basically disabling issues on most projects and then having one project with a discussions board enabled. But I also have an AMA on there. So anyone can go on there and ask me a question. I'll answer it.
Nice. I like it.
All right. Jason, Chris.
It's good to know.
Yeah, we'll go spam it.
Yeah, we'll go spam it. I swear to God, if I have to shut down this repo tonight. I was working on a cron to like automatically take the answers and publish them on my website. And if that goes
it sounds genius.
Well, now that you've said that, I've started to think about how genius that might actually be, and I'm starting to think maybe there's a moderation process that needs to be involved.
Nah, I don't think so. I think it's fine
because you can edit.
Everybody's trust.
Oh my God! Oh, I have to throw away all of this code. It's all gotta go. All gotta go.
Later.